Hi everyone, my name is Sierra and today I will be discussing critical race theory. I'll begin by discussing what I learned in the past module about my own racial identity. Something that stuck out to me specifically was the videos that we watched. I watched the conversation with white people on race, and I also watched the conversation with my black son. These videos really stood out to me because I identified with what was mostly said in the conversation with white people on race. I realized that my racial identity development was more of a lack of a racial identity. I grew up not considering myself to have a racial identity and did not consider myself to be a part of a race, or that I was white, or that white was a race. When I describe myself, I don't typically use white as an identifier. And then watching the conversation with my black son was almost a complete opposite. It was an obvious identifier, being black, and it was a factor that they couldn't avoid and that they needed to teach their children how to identify as black and how to deal with law enforcement, and it was something they couldn't avoid, and it was just such a night and day difference from within those two videos. The white racial identity model is another aspect of the module that helped me to examine my own racial identity and development. I realized that I want to strive to reach Helm's level of autonomy, where I have a positive connection to my white racial identity while striving for social justice at the same time. It's not simply enough to not be racist. It requires anti-racism. It was not until recently that I began to realize my racial identity. In my undergraduate classes, I began to realize the many privileges that I received were because of the color of my skin, the community I was raised in, because I am white. The more I learned about the inequality of people that people of color experience, the more I realized how I was socialized to not have to think about so many aspects that other racial groups are forced to be conscious of. I've never been afraid for my life when I get pulled over, or been taught how to act when dealing with law enforcement, like many people of color have had to deal with. I distinctly remember an experience I had when I was 14 or 15 in my church. The topic of African American members of my church were brought up, and the fact that African Americans were not allowed leadership positions in my church until 1978 was brought up. It was said pretty casually, and I remember thinking, wait, what? 1978 was not that long ago, especially in a church that preaches to be Christ-like and to love one another. No one questioned this, and the discussion moved on to something else. And I remember going home and asking my parents about it, and they said something along the lines that kind of brushed the topic aside and explained that it doesn't affect us now and that it's in the past. I was shocked by this, and it really opened my eyes to what people of color have experienced in our country. It also showed me how white people have had the privilege to not care and not even be conscious of the inequalities that have happened and continue to happen. When I had this experience, I was in Erikson's identity versus role confusion stage, which is when I was developing my identity and sense of self. I also think this was the first time that I questioned things I was being taught and what I believed. I wish I could say this was the life-changing experience that sparked a huge anti-racism stage of my life. It didn't. However, it did plant an idea in my head that this was wrong, and it didn't feel right, and I didn't agree with it, which I think opened the path for the rest of my life and the path that I'm on now, pursuing social work and social justice. Again, today I'm striving to be educated on institutionalized racism and systemic racism, and striving to not only be not racist but anti-racist. One action I can take to challenge power structures is rejecting the idea of neutrality and color blindness, recognizing that society has been built upon white privilege and systemic racism. As mentioned in the What is Critical Race Theory article, as a social worker, I will strive to listen, to advocate for, to advocate with the narrative and experiences of people of color to allow their voices to be heard since they have been silenced in the past. As I look back on my past experience, I wish I would have brought up my concerns and asked the questions I had and not stopped until I received the answers. It took me a lot longer than it should have to figure out things I know to be true and things I know to be wrong. However, I cannot change things in the past, so my focus is on the present, which includes educating myself, rejecting neutrality, and striving for anti-racism. And that is all I have. Thanks for listening.